Before the world knew the shape of the Third Reich, there were hidden societies, strange symbols, and secret doctrines, unfolding in the shadows of collapsing empires. In dim rooms across Austria and Germany, myth and politics began to blur, as man searched for ancient occult meanings that might explain a modern world falling apart. But ideas once imagined do not always stay confined to imagination. They take root, they grow, and sometimes they step out of the darkness into history itself. Let's return to a world where belief became ideology and where ideology became something far more dangerous, here on Things Visible and Invisible. Richard B. Spence is an American historian and professor emeritus at the University of Idaho. He specializes in modern Russian history, intelligence studies, secret societies, and the history of the occult and esoteric movements. He has written extensively on espionage and political intrigue, including works on figures such as Sidney, Reilly, and Aleister Crowley. His research often explores the intersection of intelligence operations, ideology, and unconventional belief systems in modern history. And he joins me down the line from his home in Idaho. Rick, welcome back to Things Visible and Invisible.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me on.
Rick, when it comes to the Nazis, I don't know what it's like in the United States, but here in the UK, we seem to have endless documentaries about the Nazis. And they get more sort of, shall we say, fringe as the years go on. And one of the elements that is constantly now being reached for is some kind of occult relevance for everything that the Nazis did. You've studied about this subject extensively, you've written about it. Are we dealing really with something that's real or something which is largely a prefabricated myth of historians post-World War II?
Well, Nazi occultism has become a kind of cottage industry, I think, in most of the world, certainly in America and Europe. And, you know, it combines two things that there's a widespread fascination about. And let's take the first of them as simply Hitler and the Nazis themselves. And as much as they are constantly excoriated as being the epitome of human evil, there's still a fascination with them for that very reason. Right? It's a bit like the idea that the villain is always the most interesting person in the story. You know, heroes often tend to be kind of dull, don't they? Okay, because
Yes.
they have to be morally upright. The villain doesn't have that problem. And since the Nazis, in their own particular way, went on to violate every possible rule or general assumption about goodness, kindness, or the general character of the human race, they qualify collectively as a villain, and Hitler in particular. So we're fascinated with the villains, and then occultism is another form of fascination. All you have to do is mention the word. That's why we're talking about it now.
That's right.
Because those two things go together. Overall, I'd have to say that Nazi occultism, that the idea that occultism or occult beliefs were the driving force behind the Third Reich is, in my opinion, an exaggeration. It's been blown out of proportion. Hitler's interest in occultism, I think, has been blown out of proportion. A lot of people tend to look at Hitler. They don't, if there was a genuine occultist in the Nazi elite, it would be Heinrich Himmler.
Yes.
But even he, I would categorize as a kind of fanboy. You know, Hitler wasn't a practicing occultist, but he was fascinated by the subject and was therefore willing to invest a lot of time and energy in order to explore it. But it's a popular theme, and one of the things that it can do is to explain something that otherwise is very difficult to explain. So human evil Nazis and beyond is always puzzling to us, the rest of us, because we can't quite figure out how anybody could go that wrong. What turns somebody into a serial killer? What explains Ed Gein? What explains Adolf Hitler? What's the answer for this? And a very simple one is that, well, they're all possessed by the devil. They're somehow the tools of demonic forces. And that provides a ready explanation for that, seemingly. So, on the other hand, I don't want to dismiss it to say that there's nothing there. It's the same answer you give to it. There's something to it, but the gap between the reality and the hype in this case, particularly in the case of Nazi occultism, is wide.
Okay, so Rick, that's a fascinating sort of setting out of our what we're going to explore for the next for this episode. I want to go back to just after the First World War, just before the Nazi Party came into existence. My understanding of the Weimar Republic, there were a lot of, shall we say, philosophical threads that were running through the Weimar Republic of all sorts. But there did seem to be, post-World War I, a kind of fascination with the occult. And the reason I say that is because if you look at, for example, the German films of the 1920s, you find the occult as a constant theme. And these were not fringe films, these were central films made by some of the best filmmakers. Was the Weimar Republic different from any other aspect of Europe in this aspect, that it seemed to be obsessed with occult themes?
I don't know if you could say that Weimar Germany was categorically more obsessed with occultism than you might find in France or Britain or America. It was it's a popular theme. It attracts attention. Now, it can either arouse interest in a person or it can arouse horror in someone. That is, whether you're repulsed by occultism or whether you're attracted to it, it still produces this emotional response. That's why we tend to find, it's a bit like horror movies. That's why there are so many horror movies. Apparently people like being scared. Okay, we have some sort of strange craving for this type of thing. In the case of Germany, though, there are some particular aspects that might have made segments of German society in the Weimar period more susceptible to the influence or attraction of occultism. And let's go back to the big elephant in the room, is the First World War. The First World War was it was the worst possible catastrophe which had ever befallen the world at that point. And it had, in the case of Germany, if you look at things up until 1940, between 1870 and 1914, between the creation of Germany, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, remember, prior to that, Germany was just a geographic abstraction. There was no country with that name. Things seemed to be going very well. They won a war over the French, and the industry was booming. They were becoming a big deal. These were the happy times. These were the kind of good times. I think even today, I remember I was sort of struck once in a visit to Germany as to how the sort of Kaiserian era was, the kind of, their version of the gay 90s was viewed with nostalgia, because when it was this period before any of the bad stuff that later came along had happened. So everything was going well, and then the war comes along, and that ends up in a catastrophe. And it ends up in a catastrophe, relatively speaking, worse for the Germans than anybody else, because, they lost. And they're also left holding the bag. Okay, the Austro-Hungarians just go out of business. Okay, they just see, you can't blame them for it. I don't know why you didn't blame the war on them. They're not there anymore. So the Germans get the war guilt, they get reparations, they lose territory, and suddenly this seemingly remarkable rise of this young country is now thrown into this utter confusion. So that's one of the things I think the public collectively was going, what went wrong? And then people begin to look for answers for that. And it's, there's if you go back to, let's say, more ancient times, when things went wrong, probably in Babylonia or Sumeria or wherever it might be, the first thing you would assume is that, well, what's happened? You've displeased the gods. The gods are angry. Why do we have famines? Why have we been conquered? Okay, it's because we have lost the favor of the gods. And so something on a spiritual level, and remember, occultism is simply a form of spirituality. Yes. It's all part of the same large ball of wax, so to speak. So there was certainly a reason to go into a kind of overdrive of introspection as to what had happened in the society. This is why you start looking around for people to blame. Okay, one of the hallmarks of National Socialism, of the Nazi movement, which wasn't unique to them, is anti-Semitism, and they found something to blame. What is it? It's all the blame of a traitorous minority within our own society. That's it. The Jews undermined the war effort. They did not participate in the war effort. They were not sufficiently patriotic. They exploited. They profited from the war. They did all of the bad stuff can somehow be laid to this particular group of people, who are, practically speaking, through that process, turned into demons, turned into a kind of evil force, intrinsically evil. This is one of the whole concepts of Nazi anti-Semitism, is that Jews are intrinsically, by their very flesh and blood, evil. So that was one kind of answer which the Nazis tried to incorporate in this, but there also was you tend to see this after wars. After the American Civil War of the 1860s, there was a huge boom in spiritualism. Mm-hmm. I also don't think it's too much of a surprise that it's in the aftermath of the war in the 1880s that the Ouija board is patented as a device. Why? Because lots of young men had died, their families grieved them, and wished to communicate with them if they possibly could. Now, that wasn't something that everybody wanted to do, but it was something that many people wanted to do. So in the case of Weimar Germany, you've got a country which is confused about its identity, which feels resentful, suffering from the psychological burdens of defeat, and which is also awash in grief for the 2 million or so men that died during the war. And then when you begin to add things like a very unstable economy, unstable politics, one could argue in this case is whether the instability in politics was a cause of more psychic problems in the society, or that was just a manifestation of it itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, what the picture you're painting, Richard, is very much a sort of Rick, is a witch's brew, no pun intended, of possibilities bubbling up in the Weimar Republic. In the midst of this, then we have the emergence of Adolf Hitler, whose rise is often sort of sometimes choreographed from an occult perspective, because it is so unusual, because it is, I mean, one minute he's a corporal, the next minute he's the leader of Germany. It seems to be a story which doesn't quite add up for a lot of people, so they reach for that kind of, there must be some other dynamic pushing it forward. My understanding, and I'd like your view on this, is that what I've understood about Hitler is that people have, as you alluded to at the start, ascribed a lot of esoteric or occult ideas to him, but in essence, he was somebody who didn't really have a lot of time for this, and in fact was quite dismissive of, for example, Himmler's interest in all of this. Was that something which was constant through his political career, or was it something which came towards the end of it?
Hitler's been described by one biographer, I'm going to forget which one it is at this point, as I think it's Joachim Fest, German biographer of Hitler, who described him as a kind of enigma in many ways, a man who outside of his political persona just really doesn't seem to be there. And it's, part of the Nazi myth itself is that Hitler was a dynamic, he was a great leader. He was a kind of Superman to a certain degree. He had extraordinary abilities and characteristics. He was a genius of the ages. You can add any kind of accolade you want to him. He wasn't an ordinary human being, in that view. He was the Fuhrer. Yet, I have to admit that when I look at him, I don't see anything particularly exceptional about him at all. I mean, this I think is the kind of, to me, is the puzzling thing about Adolf Hitler, is that, well, stripped of his obvious role in history, the role which he played as the Chancellor of Germany from 1933 to 1945, a very destructive and ruinous role, he is otherwise a man of no notable accomplishments. So keep in mind, again, let's kind of go back a ways. He's, he comes from a background which is pretty ordinary. His father was a man who worked his way up from the peasantry to a kind of minor government official, the kind of lower middle class. Hitler basically seems to have aspired to at least the same thing. He spent all of his, he drops out of high school, basically because he appears to be too lazy to effectively study. He makes what is ultimately a kind of half-hearted effort to go to art school. And I don't know, some people go to art school with great zeal and accomplish things. In another case, going to art school seems to be a choice for somebody who can't think of anything else to do. Or go to grad school and become an historian. Maybe that's it as well. He showed no ambition. He was, if he had been around today, he'd be somebody who would be 30 and living in their mother's basement. Okay, that's essentially what Hitler was. If he was down and out in Vienna, he was down and out in Vienna. Why? Because he refused to get a job. Okay, there were jobs available. He didn't want one. No, because he wanted to be an artist, but he didn't really want to work hard to be an artist. What he wanted to do was to have enough money to go around, visit museums, read books, and his favorite thing to do, sit around in cafes and talk. All right? So, as far as I can see, unambitious, lazy, not particularly talented in anything. And then the only regular job he ever had in his entire life was being a soldier in World War I. Now, he volunteered for the army, not the army he was supposed to be in, by the way. So, remember, Hitler was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was an ethnic German there, but he wasn't a German. He doesn't become a German citizen until, I think, 1932? Okay. I mean, at various points, the Weimar government could have deported him back to Austria. They never quite got around to doing that. So he has no exceptional characteristics. Frankly, I've known a lot of guys like that. And so how did this person who was a nobody in most respects, who in some respects was a kind of social failure, other than his service in the war. And keep in mind, when the war is over, he stays in the army because he has no other prospects. He basically stays in the army because it was 40 marks a month, 3 meals a day, clothes on his back, and a roof over his head. Otherwise, he'd have to go out and get a job, which is the one thing in his life that Adolf Hitler always avoided as much as possible. So, what he finds in the aftermath of the war, now during the war, his service is, there's often, I think, a tendency to look at everything, because Hitler becomes this evil pathological figure. We're always trying to figure out, well, there must have been something in his childhood or in his adolescence. We must be able to see his depravity in his art. No, I don't think you find any. His art was mediocre. I mean, he could paint, he could draw, he had some degree of talent. And I would virtually guarantee that if you saw his paintings and somebody didn't tell you they were by Adolf Hitler, you would think that, you probably wouldn't want one, but they would seem to be okay. Now, the minute you're told that they're Hitler's paintings, then you start becoming all Freudian, and you're going to go through them and try to figure out how everything in the pictures demonstrates some sort of, this is the budding psychopath right there. It doesn't. Okay. He was just a mediocre artist. That's all that really amounted to. His upbringing, his childhood, everything again is other people had that. There's nothing extraordinary about it. In fact, it's incredibly ordinary in that. Even his wartime service. I mean, he was essentially a runner back and forth between headquarters and the front line. That did involve some people have argued, well, he never actually fought. He was always skirting duty. No, runner's job was dangerous. And he got an Iron Cross for that, recommended by his commanding officer, who happened to be Jewish. So there you go. And there's not even anything. One of the questions that often comes up is that, well, when did Hitler's anti-Semitism manifest itself? Was it always there? Did he drink it with his mother's milk? All the way through the period up to, in his sort of Vienna, his bumming around Vienna, his being a slacker in Vienna before the war, and then even during the war, as far as I can see, there's no particular evidence of that. One of the things he did in his Vienna days is that he took to painting pictures or making drawings, and he could make a certain amount. What he did is that he sold those not to people who were interested in the art, really, but to the owners of frame shops. So you had people who what they were selling is the picture frame. But it's just like if you go into a store today and you want to buy a picture frame, there's a picture of somebody you don't know because they want to show you what it looks like. So frame shop owners bought Hitler's pictures so they could put them in their frames to sell them. That's how insignificant it was. But many, if not most of the frame dealers he dealt with were Jewish. He seemed to have no problem with that.
So I mean, Rick, you've painted a very interesting picture of Adolf Hitler, but let's zone in a little bit, if there is anything in terms of any interest in the occult or secret societies. The Thule Society is often thrown around. In your researches, I mean, have you found anything that was something which was helping to form his political ideology, which was coming from an occult base?
Well, if you're looking for occult influences on history, on Hitler, excuse me, he was interested in a lot of things. Remember, this was a guy who would sit around cafes and chat. He liked talking about politics.
Sure.
He liked reading. He tended to read broadly, anything he could get his hands on. And in his Vienna days, he was, I think at one point, a subscriber, or at least a regular reader of a publication called Ostara. And that was the publication, I can't remember, I think of an Austrian occultist. I think this is Guido von List. And there was a movement. So keep in mind, in the pre-war era, on the fringes, of culture and society, there was a movement which emerged, which has been called Ariosophy, the Ariosophist movement. So, what on earth was that? Well, in the late 19th century, a movement came to being called Theosophy. I think you may have heard of that. That gets mentioned. It's still around today. And Theosophy was basically the invention of a Russian woman by the name of Helena Blavatsky. Mm-hmm. And Blavatsky, very briefly, was the same thing you find in many cases. She viewed herself as a psychic medium. She may have had some psychic powers. Those were abetted by a significant degree of fakery and charlatanism. All right, I tend to find this in all of these. There may be some sort of real ability there, but that ability in and of itself, one of the things about psychic abilities is that they're quite inconsistent. They're kind of there sometimes, and sometimes they're not. So learning tricks is a good way to amplify the effects of that, and the audience really can't tell the difference. But Theosophy, Blavatsky's invention, came up with this whole kind of history of the human race in which humanity went through a process not just of physical evolution, but of spiritual evolution. So she had this whole idea about the evolution of root races, and the first root race, and they each became, first more corporeal than the last one. And so in the kind of later incarnations, the present day, that is late 19th century version of humanity, one of these elements were the Aryans. Okay. Although if you look at it, and I'll leave this to anybody who's interested, if you actually look at Blavatsky's descriptions of Aryans, she's not talking about blonde, blue-eyed Germans to the extent that they are. That's not what she was really talking about. But it was an idea that caught on. And this is the thing you find, is that someone comes up with an idea. Blavatsky came up with an idea that attracted a lot of people's attention. The concept of spiritual evolution, of advancing races, and of course it meant that the most current race was superior to the ones in the past because, they were primitive. And that then was adopted. There were two characters in particular, both centered around in Vienna. One of them was a fellow by the name of Lanz von Liebenfels, and the other was a fellow who called himself Guido von List. And they formed small secret societies, attracted. But these are on the fringe. This is not a significant movement. Most people in Vienna or anywhere went about their business without even knowing these guys existed. But what they did is they took Blavatsky's idea of spiritual and physical evolution and of Aryans, and they then identified that with the Germanic peoples in particular, and somehow proclaimed that this showed that that the Germanic peoples were the most advanced race. This was sort of their takeoff on Blavatsky. So we know that Hitler, in this period, was exposed to those ideas. He read them, but he read lots of stuff. And it's not at all clear to me that this had any particular influence. I mean, this is the question here. It's not whether or not someone reads something, it's what influence that actually had on their thinking. Yes. But I put it this way. He was aware of those ideas, and somewhere they were kind of filed away in the back of his head. He at least knew that those ideas existed. In the early 20s, once Hitler's political career has begun, another kind of interesting connection point between Hitler and occultism was that in 1923, so again, to give a basic chronology, in 1919, Hitler joins the German Workers' Party. And he rises rapidly in its ranks, and really within a few months has become its effective leader. And that's because it was a small organization. If you join a party that has 150 people in it, it's not too hard to become the leader with a bit of ambition. And his political career really gets going in 1921, 1920, 1922. He's getting a certain amount of local press in Munich. So he's still not a national political figure by that point. But in 1923, there is a German writer by the name of Ernst Schertel. And Ernst Schertel is a kind of interesting figure. He's a professed occultist, a student of the occult. He's that. But he's better known as a very active proponent of what might be called alternative sexual practices. Basically, he was very much interested in BDSM and nudism. Okay, so you got to keep in mind. So Schertel is a alternative sexuality nudist occultist who in 23 wrote a book, his sort of manual, which was titled Magic, Its History, Theory, and Practice. And he sent a copy of that book to Adolf Hitler. Now, that's kind of interesting because Hitler, again, is not a big name at this point. He's not a national political figure. But Schertel saw something that attracted his attention, Hitler, so here's a copy of my book. And this found its way into Hitler's library. It's one of those parts, and it was still there in parts of his library that survived. And the interesting thing about it is that in the book, there were 66 annotations in Hitler's hands. So we know he read it. And we know he apparently thought about it because he thought enough about it to 66 times make some sort of marginal note about what he was reading. So what that suggests to me is that this book just appears essentially in the mail. If Hitler had absolutely no interest in the subject of magic and occultism at all, he would never have looked at it. He would have thrown it in the trash, given it to somebody else, do what you and I do with books that we're not interested in, stick them on the bookshelf somewhere and forget about them. But he didn't. He read it and he took notes. Yes. On the other hand, that was the type of thing that Hitler did with many books about many subjects that he read. He did tend to read and think and make notes about what he was reading. So, while I think it shows that Hitler was interested enough in the topic to read it and think about it, that is, to absorb, to engage with the material, I guess that's what we're saying, that while he was willing to engage with the material, I don't think it shows that he was any more interested in that than he might have been in other subjects. But there are these ideas that are kind of filed away. So the more important thing might be, what was it that Schertel in his book basically said about magic and the occult? What was his whole idea about theory and practice? What is that theory? What was the practice he proposed? Schertel, in his basic approach to magical technique, is very similar, and I don't think that he's modeling himself on many of Crowley's ideas. So I think I might have said in a past episode, I've certainly said in other episodes, that Crowley, to sort of some of his ideas, was that magic is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. That is, one can use focus, mental focus, willpower in order to, as they would say today, to manifest the reality you want. Or do you think of it this way, that you can bend reality to your will if you know the right techniques and you put enough oomph into it? And that's basically what Schertel's book proposes. It's a whole idea of rituals that you can form, focusing exercises. And his first idea is to figure out what you want and then focus your energy on that. Try to get as much assistance you can from the forces in the occult realm. Perform rituals. If necessary, perform sacrifices. But I think the point here is that, figure out what you want and then focus your attention and try to manifest that reality. Now, that I could see as advice that Adolf Hitler might well have found useful. Because you could argue that, in a way, he does that. Someone who was no one. I think there's another, at the very beginning of his post-war career, even before he joins the German Workers' Party. Remember, he's still in the army in this period. He's drafted as a propagandist, a political operative for the army. And they were the ones who gave him the job of giving patriotic speeches to other soldiers to keep them away from communism. And that's where he learned, arguably, that he had a talent for public speaking and a talent that could influence other people. I mean, this is what his immediate superior in the post-war army, Captain Karl Maria, figured out. Hitler could talk effectively, and other soldiers listened to him. So we're going to give him some classes to teach him to be more effective to that. And they're actually also the ones that get him to join the German Workers' Party, to join this small party and influence it. So he's completely the tool of his military superiors at this point. But Meyer, the officer who really gets Hitler's whole career going, who picks him out as someone who could be an effective speaker, an effective propagandist, described Hitler at the time he found him as a dog looking for a master. That was it. A person, again, a guy who had no other significance, but here, he apparently did have some kind of talent, but only because someone else, Meyer, saw that and gave him a means to use it.
So, I mean, it sounds, Rick, like, you've painted a very interesting picture, which, if I may say, just adds to the enigma of Adolf Hitler, because he's somebody who seems to be picking up random ideas and somehow just managing to create something from them. If we could bring Heinrich Himmler into this just for a moment now, because Himmler is somebody who is often the first port of call for people who want to link the Nazis with the occult, and by all accounts had a more serious interest in the occult, not just in a sort of theoretical way, but almost in a practical way, when one thinks of what he was doing with the SS and that sort of thing. Was Himmler influenced by these similar strands that were circulating around the Weimar Republic, or did he come from something a little bit different?
Well, some people have tried to make a point that both Hitler and Himmler come from Roman Catholic backgrounds.
That's right.
And I think I don't know how many of the people who point that out are Protestants, but at any rate, the idea that Roman Catholicism is very rich in its own form of occultism and pageantry and imagery. And the assumption there seems to be an assumption I don't buy, but I can see where somebody come to it, that kind of predisposes one towards occult beliefs. So I don't know. Without attempting to, please don't take this as blasphemy, but let's put it this way. If you go through, let's say, the ritual of the Mass, or you participate in a ritual in which you believe, or you are told that you must believe, that there is a magical, incredibly important there is a cosmic transformation of the materials, the wafer and wine before you, and this has huge spiritual significance for you, even though the testimony of your eyes sees nothing taking place. That is one, it is all of this is, remember, everything that is happening there is hidden from your eyes, therefore it is occulted. But that, the simplest way of putting it is that if you believe that, then what else might you be predisposed to believe? What whether to some degree, does that possibly open someone more to the influences of occult beliefs than it might otherwise?
But
I don't really buy that, because I see the same sort of thing in, let's say, Protestant Pentecostalism. So, I mean, does snake handling make you more susceptible to occult beliefs?
Well, I think, I mean, just on that, I mean, I think this is a well-worn path, but that the lack of belief that people like Himmler and Hitler had, etc., then they're looking to believe in something else. I mean, that's just, human beings need something to believe in. So, I mean, in some ways, what you've pointed out is that a very kind of supernatural view of the world, or elements within the world, if that's removed from one creed, one understanding of the world, then people are maybe susceptible looking for other creeds. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of many people in the world of the occult who, I mean,
yeah,
our friend.
I think you've hit upon a very important point there. Is that while both Himmler and Hitler and others were raised in a Catholic tradition, they very clearly reject that.
That's right.
And develop a great, I think Hitler's view towards the Catholic Church later on was that he was perfectly willing to make deals with the Vatican over things because it was necessary. But his view was, what's the future of the church? He goes, in the future, we're going to crush it like a toad.
That's right. But if you look at Himmler, for example, I mean, from the little I've read around this subject, I mean, it would appear that he understood the power of ritual. And Goebbels, I think, was also of a Catholic background, and he understood the power of image, for the masses. So, but just on Himmler, I mean, do you in your researches, Rick, do you see him as a bona fide devotee of the occult, or somebody who was dabbling in it, or playing with it, or using it?
I think he was very interested in it. He had a real. Hitler may have had an occasional interest.
Yes.
Was that the feeling that Hitler's interest was always going in three different directions at once? He was easily distracted from one purpose and then attracted to something else. Himmler was strongly interested in occult ideas, and an example of that might have been is that, of course, he had a fellow around him who for a while became his kind of Rasputin, his spiritual guru. And this was a fellow by the name of Wiligut, Karl Maria Wiligut. And who is he? At one time, he'd been a German army officer, minor civil official. He was a man who was very interested in the Ariosophist ideas I talked about earlier. And also had conjured up his whole, there's usually some sort of invented past. So his idea was that in the past there had been this, I think what he was doing is creating out his version of Germanic druids. There was this ancient German priestly class, and that these had held the secrets of the original Aryan religion that had come from Hyperborea or whatever ancient non-existent continent he wanted to attach it to. And the typical idea that there was some kind of ancient religion which I'm going to resurrect. And he felt that much of that was entrusted in the runes. So Wiligut's great interest was on rune magic and interpreting the runes. And runes, often as other letters in alphabet, often have a kind of symbolic meaning. But he took that to a kind of whole new level of trying to build a kind of entire religious structure around the magic of the runes. Now, there were some problems with Wiligut. He was a former mental patient. Okay, he had been committed for a certain time. Himmler was disturbed when he eventually found that out, but didn't reject him entirely. I don't know what it says, something that Wiligut had been committed by a rather vengeful wife. So what was going, I don't know. There are personal problems there. But Wiligut again strikes me as another combination of the this strange amalgam of the true believer and the charlatan. Okay, someone who believes certain things, they can't really prove them, so they'll fake it to make it look like they can, even though they'll still argue that the fakery is still based upon a belief which is legitimate. But Wiligut is, I mean, in many ways, he's and other people around Himmler thought that Wiligut was simply a ridiculous figure. Other people in the SS did not take him seriously, but Himmler did. And I think that suggests that, Himmler is not some kind of, Himmler's not Sauron. He's not some sort of great occult master of the black arts. He's a guy he's a fanboy who's interested in this stuff and is easily suckered or enthused by other people around him. But he does put a number of things together. He really wanted to turn the SS into a kind of Jesuit-like order. I think there's a little Catholic inspiration, that this is going to be, it's not just going to be, I mean, what did he take over? The Schutzstaffel, the SS, began as a branch of the Brown Shirts, the SA, as a particular bodyguard for Hitler. Mm-hmm. And Himmler took what was essentially a guard service and was going to turn it into a whole new religious order with rituals, with a ritual headquarters at Wewelsburg Castle. He was going to embed astrological and other occult symbolism in it. But he wanted to turn this into a kind of quasi-monastic or holy order for some sort of new religion that he was going to create. And one of the things that's always true about occultism is that it's syncretic. It's always mutating. It's always adding things from one tradition or another. This is why you can borrow from Theosophy, you can borrow from Buddhism. You can take all the different pieces that you want and you can put them together and create something else. Crowley did that. Gerald Gardner did that. I think every occultist who's come along has done that in some way. You take what is already there and then you change it and add something to it on your own. And Himmler was creative in that kind of sense. But what he's doing is purely derivative from things that already exist.
I mean, I'm wondering how much of this was, as you say, and I think you've put it very well, Rick, that he's kind of a fanboy. He's interested in this and he's taking elements of it to broaden a political program as much as an occult or religious ideal. I mean, he was playing around with different strands of these things for the broader glory, if you like, of the Nazi Party. I mean, I suppose, is that the crux, that this was as much about a political program as opposed to a serious occult search on the part of Himmler?
Well, Himmler strikes me as a serious student of the occult, or he wanted to be. So he also does something else. Around 1935, he takes an already extant research organization called the Ahnenerbe. And the Ahnenerbe basically is the Ancestral Research Society. And what it had been formed of in the early part of the Nazi, it was formed in the early part of the Nazi regime. It only around 35 becomes a part of the SS. That is, the SS takes it over. And the goal was, again, to research ancient Germanic religions, customs, all of this stuff that Richard Wagner was putting in his operas. Okay, the kind of romanticized, non-existent German past that Wagner created. They wanted to go back and search through the past, to go through and do a kind of, not so much a physical archaeological exploration, but in some ways, a kind of psychic exploration, an intellectual excavation of the past. Here's an interesting example. One of the things that Himmler became quite interested in was in witches, and in particular, the trials of German witches, say back in the 15th and 16th centuries. So one of the things that people ought to imagine is that witch trials and the persecution of witchcraft was something from the medieval era. It's not. It's something from the early modern era. So, nobody much bothered about witches back in the 12th and 13th centuries. This all is sort of around the time of the Reformation. That's when the witch persecutions begin. And he actually, within the Ahnenerbe, set up a special department called the Hexenkartothek. Hexe is the German word for witch. And this was, the best way to put it, it was the special witchcraft research group. And their whole job was to collect as much information as they could about old German witches. And the way you did that was you often went through the records of the trials, and those can be very interesting in terms of trying to figure out what it was that these people actually believed and practiced. Because in some cases, witches on trial could become extraordinarily chatty about what it was they were doing. This is how we were organized, this is the leader, this is how people were dressed, these were how the rituals were carried out. Here again, there's always the question as to how much of this was legitimate and how much they were making up on the spot, but it's only the thing you've got to go by. So why was Himmler so interested in having people, go through old witch trial records to try to reconstruct what German witchcraft in the 15th century was like? Because he had been convinced, I think, partly through people like Wiligut, who again believed that there had been this ancient Germanic Aryan religion, and that in some way German witches in the 15th century were the last heirs to that. And if you could figure out what they believed, you could begin to find clues about what the original Aryan religion was.
Okay. Rick,
it came down to this idea that country people, the people closest, that bumpkins out in the countryside in their ancient traditions are the closest we can get to our past. There's some legitimacy in that. That old traditions survive longer there than they do in the city. Cities become cosmopolitan, something which the Nazis hated. Cities become, things are, all kinds of different influences come in. But if you can find some kind of remote town somewhere where people have been doing the same thing for the last 800 years, you may be able to get an actual glimpse into the past. So, Himmler was interested in witchcraft, not for the sake of witchcraft, but for the sake that he believed that witchcraft was the survival of some more ancient religious traditions.
Yes. Interesting. Rick, unfortunately, time has beaten us. We could go on and on and on. We're going to have to return to this subject, I think, at some point. But for now, tell people where they can find out more about you and where they can pick up a copy of your book.
Well, anybody who's interested in my books, probably Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult. I think that's still available on Amazon or wherever you can find books. You should be able to find it there. It's still in print as far as I know. My other books, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, is still available. Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Reilly, I think is out of print. Hopefully it will be back in print, but there are still copies available. You can find all of those. I guess the main thing that I would want to pitch at the present is the podcast I do with Stephen Austin, which anybody who has access to YouTube or to Podbean or to Spotify, it's called Strange as It Seems. And indeed, we have episodes that deal with this very topic and many others. And I hope you might try that out. And then also the work that I've done for the Great Courses, which includes The Real History of Secret Societies, that's a 24-episode series. Crimes of the Century. Secrets of the Occult, another 24-episode series. Another one just came out earlier this year, Great Villains of History. And there may be more of those in the future, so you can certainly check those out. Anybody who has an Amazon Prime subscription on their TV can go through that and find the Great Courses collection and possibly find some of my work there as well. So that's my sales pitch.
For now, Rick, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.